Alright everyone, it's time for Occult Literature, video number 259, getting up there now. American Medicinal Herbs and Leaves. This is a 67-page manuscript, so it's intermediate in length. It's a larger herbal work than the last one that I did by the same author, Alice Henkel, actually. It's from the U.S. Department of Agriculture, early 20th century. Now, link in the description to my edition of this work on Amazon. It is fully illustrated with over 30 illustrations by Rita Metzner. She redid all of the illustrations because, you know, in works of that era, a lot of times it's not very visible. And so even if you were to grab the image and like slap it into your work, it just wouldn't look right. It would look like it was printed in that old style, and it's really subpar. So she redid all the illustrations. Second and third links are to my books, blogs, both Blogspot and WordPress. There are a couple of dozen different works in the herbal and medicinal category. Some of it's homeopathy. Some of it's actual, like, receipt books, family physicians and so forth that have, like, tips and tricks about healing, simple recipes, apothecarian in nature. Some of them are actual herbals, and a few works that are more historical. It's very interesting. This is probably the most interesting category of work that I work with, other than maybe the fortune-telling sort of divination stuff, because I like dream interpretation, use it in my own practice. Now, the number of species here is larger than before. The other herbal only had about a dozen. This one, again, has more than 30. And these are North American species, mostly native to the region of the continental United States. But some of them were garden escapees, because what happened is people came over from Europe and planted things, ornamentals, crops that they wanted, and then they escaped into the wild. Like you have a big problem with giant hogsweed, for example, choking waterways in the United States now. It's not native to the North American continent. So these are medicinal species, and mostly this is about the habitat they're found in, what they look like, illustrated of course, their form, what part of the plant is used, and then it gives sort of a brief little bit about what it's used for, and the then modern price, which is usually like, 5 cents per pound of this material, and it's like, it sounds very little, but back then 5 cents mattered. It's very interesting because you have some of these species are psychotropic in nature, like Jimson weed. All parts of that plant predominantly are potentially of use within medicine, and you've got to understand some of these things are still used today. They're just not used within a mainstream Western context. The number of people, even in the Western world, who use herbal medicine, homeopathy of some variant or another is still relatively high. It's got to be a double-digit proportion of the population that at least practices it in accompaniment with mainstream medicine. There are definitely millions of Americans alone that practice herbal medicine and homeopathy exclusively. They don't trust the modern medical complex. Now, of course, I have misgivings about that. I think that herbal medicine and the accompaniment of alternative medicine in general is okay for most things. It's not going to cure your cancer. It's not going to cure HIV or some virus. But for most things, it's potentially harmless because most things don't tend to kill you anyway. And as far as disease goes, a lot of them are caused by stress and they're psychosomatic anyway, so it doesn't matter whether you use a placebo or an herbal compound or something from a laboratory, it's going to have roughly the same effect usually. This is a good little book, and it's definitely one of the better herbal guides if you're in North America anyway, because this is for North American species. If you intend to attempt to identify these things in the wild, gather them for your own use or whatever, and I'm not recommending you do. Disclaimer, I'm not saying that that's safe or even necessarily legal. You're responsible for your own actions. I hate having to say this every time I mention herbal medicine. It's the way the law works. If you did intend to do that, this would be one of the guides that would be most necessary. And keep in mind, this is the pre-atomic era. This is an era in which, industry in the modern sense is very new. The Industrial Revolution starts in the middle of the 19th century, but it doesn't really get moving until the Gilded Age. So this is an era in which the urban world is running smack up against nature, and they're trying to exploit nature, natural materials, mineral compounds, plants, and so forth, animal compounds sometimes. Buffon's alvarius, you can get high off certain toads, believe it or not. And it's very interesting, and the whole idea behind these U.S. Department of Agriculture circulars under Henkel and others was specifically the U.S. at the time was importing a lot of herbal goods. Well, they didn't want to keep importing them. They said, well, the nation will be more wealthy if we don't have to import all this stuff. Maybe we can even export some of these things. We got all these species right in our own backyards. It's all out there. We've just got to teach these rural folk how to identify them, and then they can bring them into the apothecaries, and we won't have to bring them in from England or whatever anymore. It worked. By the way, the U.S. became a massive agricultural muscle in every possible sense of the word long before the World War II period, long before, post-World War II atomic era ever began. We were already one of the main agricultural nations in the world. So it's an interesting historical piece as well. Highly recommended. Again, 67 pages in length, fully illustrated. Link in the description again to my edition of this work on Amazon. The books blog, second and third links, Blogspot and WordPress. Go to the herbal category if you're into this stuff. You can find many other works, including, I believe, 2 others by Henkel, both also illustrated by Metzner. So definitely interesting works, very much worth a read. That's about all. Peace out.